want to take away your hamburgers, we want to take away your cars, we want to take away your gas stoves.
We want you to eat maggots. Even with Trump, who's probably been our biggest hurdle to get through from a personal standpoint, because pretty much everyone else in the party kind of gets it, except for the crazy people. In 1990, over 80% of Americans self-identified as environmentalists. Over 80% of Americans in the year 1991. That number is 38% today.
Yeah, really, okay, calm down. Really great to be back here at the Benson Center, which is just, I think, a really unique and important institution that was many years ahead of its time. Now, universities across the country are trying to build their own version of the Benson Center, but we did it first. It's my pleasure to welcome Benji Backer here to Boulder. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he's probably done more than any other single person to bridge the partisan divide on environmental issues, which, as those of you who know me know, is near and dear to my heart. He's the founder and executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition. He has a new initiative, which we may or may not talk about as he chooses. Forbes 30 Under 30. He is the author of a bestseller called The Conservative Environmentalist. There's many free copies outside. I encourage you all to pick it up. It's a really interesting book. And maybe let's start there.
Sure.
You're a conservative environmentalist. What is that?
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I know that the title of a conservative environmentalist probably doesn't make much sense for a lot of people who are either conservative or environmentalists, because it seems like an oxymoron, but we'll get into why that's not the case. A little bit of background about me before I get into that. I grew up in Wisconsin, but I have a near and dear love for Colorado in my heart. My sister went to Colorado College in the Springs, and then my first encounter with nature as I know it was in Estes Park, Colorado, when I was 2 years old, and then 3 years old, and then 4 years old. We went 3 years in a row, and that was my first kind of repeated experience in nature, and that's what really, I would say, had me fall in love with the environment. And so just it's great to be back in this beautiful state. And Matt has done an amazing job. Obviously, he did an amazing job here, but I give him a lot of credit for showing how much this issue can transcend party lines, and that's really what fuels me. I am a lifelong conservative activist. I got inspired by John McCain when he was debating Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential election, and I started knocking doors and making phone calls when I was 10 years old. I had a buzz cut, I was really chubby, and my voice hadn't changed. And my parents were not political at all, so they thought it was incredibly weird. But they also, of course, the loving parents that they are, were very supportive of me doing this weird thing. Fast forward 8 years, I'm in a college classroom and I'm watching Trump face Clinton on the debate stage again, and I'm watching it during my college class. I'm a freshman at this point in college at the University of Washington, where I went because I wanted to go somewhere I could hike and ski. And I know you can hike and ski here too, but it's just a different school. I really felt dismayed by the way that they were talking about the environment. On one side you had kind of the world's burning down and we need to ban fossil fuels and get rid of anything that we deem as dirty, and then the other side basically was saying that we don't need to do anything about it and that it's all a hoax. And so from that class I tweeted out, hey, I'm going to start an organization to get conservatives back into the environmental conversation. Fast forward now 8 years again, I guess we're speaking in eights now. I'm 26 and the organization has over 55,000 members across the country. We have about 200 chapters. I've just written this book that came out a little bit earlier this year, and really just trying, my life mission is to make environmental issues nonpartisan again. They were in the 1980s and the 1990s. I believe they can be again. Because when I'm at Estes Park when I'm 2 years old, or if I'm at Estes Park when I'm 26, I don't care about partisan politics. I care about protecting that place for future generations. And we've been able to see a lot of progress on this. But the fact that you can't say you're a conservative environmentalist without people kind of raising their eyebrows is part of the problem that we're trying to change. Because now when you say you're an environmentalist, it automatically has this label that you are, Prius driving, which I do drive a hybrid, so I guess, I'm kind of like falling within this category myself. But you're a Prius driving hippie who, just doesn't care about anything but the planet, and you're gonna tell everyone about how much you love it, and everyone else is gonna have to listen, and also you believe in a certain set of political beliefs, and that used to not be the case. And so I think we need to get back to the days where environmentalism and environmental dialogues have span both political sides, and I think we're getting a lot closer to that. So the book's meant to kind of help do that. The organization that I started is meant to help do that, and I think we're getting a lot closer.
So I want to throw out a couple of touchstones just so people can remember how much the polarization of environmental issues has changed. So in the late 1980s, there was a Republican congresswoman from Rhode Island who's now a retired Boulder resident named Claudine Schneider, who led bipartisan climate legislation and had both Al Gore and Newt Gingrich as co-sponsors. This is in the late 80s. Okay, well, I moved to the United States from Canada. We were talking earlier how I wasn't allowed into NREL earlier for the event today. This is a foreign national. And
you look pretty scary.
Yeah. So I moved to the United States in 2009 to Minnesota. Our governor at the time was named Tim Pawlenty, and at the time that I moved to the U.S. in 2009, he was in favor of cap and trade. Fast forward to
For president.
That's where I'm going next.
Sorry. Oops.
Fast forward to 2016. And it was taboo on the Republican presidential primary stage, which I believe included Tim Pawlenty that year.
2012.
Oh, he ran in 2012, my mistake. Well, this would also apply in 2012. It was taboo to acknowledge the issue. A year before was when Senator Imhoff threw a snowball right in 2015 on the floor of Congress. So here you are, sitting in an undergrad class, tweeting that you want to start a conservative environmental organization. And what were you expecting?
I was expecting absolutely nothing. Like, I actually thought that I might just get ratioed, which for those of you who don't have a Twitter account, which, good for you, you're better off for it. It's basically when more people go after you and hate you than actually like what you're saying. So I didn't really know for sure what was going to happen. I actually thought that there'd be positive response among my generation. But I was thinking that I might be starting like a blog or like just a Twitter page or some sort of like social media account for conservatives who cared about the environment and maybe just grow it from that. But I ended up getting about 25 individual responses from people saying, hey, I would love to help out with this. And a lot of the people who responded to that are still active with our organization today, including so I'm chairman of the board now, including our CEO. Our CEO and our COO are both people who responded to that original tweet. So, we've built an amazing team, but I didn't expect, I think on one hand, I'm super frustrated by the lack of progress in the national discourse, which we can get to, but I also don't think I would have imagined this much progress in terms of policy alignment between the two sides. Like, people don't really know that it's happening, but it's happening. And when we started, there were 2 Republicans in Congress who said that climate change is real and that we should do something about it. Now there are over 150. Like, that's a lot of change in really like 6-ish years since we actually grew to an organization that people paid attention to. So it's definitely imperfect, as I'm sure we'll get to, but there's been a lot of progress. And when I tweeted that, I had no idea that it would turn into this national movement. I had no plan for it to. I was a freshman in college. I was worried about going to parties and which girls to talk to, and I didn't really think that it was going to turn into this. But I spent the rest of my college days, sitting in a fraternity, bedroom, sending out emails to potential donors, and I flew and testified at Congress, and then came right back and slept in my fraternity bedroom after testifying in Congress with Greta Thunberg. So, it was a really wild experience, but I definitely did not expect that to happen, nor did I expect the amount of progress that has happened to happen.
If you ever wonder how you can be a fraternity member and not party, this is the answer.
I'm the guy. I'm the lame guy that you should talk to.
Okay, so you had this call with other young conservatives that responded to your tweet. you reached out to the heads of the young Republicans, right, in every state.
Yep.
And how many responded?
Each college Republican at the time, college Republicans are kind of not a thing as much anymore because the Trump stuff kind of made it difficult. But there was every state had a really robust organization, and each state had a state director that oversaw all the chapters, like Boulder or whatever. And so we got 46 of the 50 state chairs of college Republicans to sign on to a letter saying that climate change and clean energy were important to them. And then we blasted that out to members of Congress. We met with members of Congress about it. We blasted it out to the media. We had, all 46 of them shared on their social media. And it became kind of like a mini wave of attention towards this brand new organization that no one had ever heard of. And some people were like, okay, maybe this group of like 18 to 20-year-olds actually is going to do something real. Because of course there's a lot of skepticism of a 19-year-old who's like starting a nonprofit with a bunch of other 19-year-olds. Sounds like a scam. But it really ended up being that kind of first step of activism of getting these 46 showed that like this was going to be a real movement. And it was a really pretty easy lift. We just had to call up 50 people who represented these influential organizations and get them to sign on. But that was really easy because every young person cares about this regardless of their partisan identity. And we didn't really, the only people that we didn't get signed on were pretty much people who we couldn't get a hold of for one reason or the other. It wasn't like they were like, screw you, no. We just had to release it at some point. So it was a really good kind of microcosm of, I think, what we were about to build, which was something that was way bigger than these 46 people, but it was represented by them.
And so it seems like one of the things that showed, which now the media covers the polling on very often, but back then we didn't know, which is that most young Republicans care about this issue, a clear majority. And that makes it an electorally potent issue. So tell me about the Conservative Climate Caucus. In 2021, John Curtis starts the Conservative Climate Caucus. You mentioned there's something like 150 Republican members of Congress that have stated publicly that they believe in climate change and want to do something about it. Almost 100 of them are members of this caucus. Tell me about the origin story of that.
Yeah, so I mean, all of my best memories and ideas have all come while I was hiking. So this story also starts while I was hiking. So I was in Utah, where John Curtis represents. So he represents Provo and at the time he represented Provo and all the schools around there. He actually ended up representing it's the youngest district in the entire country. And so he knew that this issue was important to his constituents. He's a Republican, former mayor of Provo. And he called me up one day, I think the summer of 2020, and he was like, Benji, I want to lead on this stuff, I don't know how to, and you're the only person I can really find who is trying to push this too. And so later on in the fall, we went on a hike together, and we started comparing notes, because there were a few other members of Congress who had expressed interest in being active in this issue, and basically, we're like, what if we got them all together? The people that you know and the people that I know in Congress who want to do something about this. What if we got them together outside of DC where everyone has their guards up and worked on getting a plan together of where the Republican Party should head on climate change. So 4 months later from that hike where we had that idea, 25 Republican members of Congress flew out in the middle of COVID. There was a lot going on. It was just the beginning of a new congressional session, so not an ideal time. In the middle of winter, and there's a lot of people who don't want to go to Utah in winter, which I don't understand, because that's the best time to go out west. But, we had 25 members of Congress from all over the country. We had Kansas, we had Oklahoma, we had out east, it was everywhere, Florida. And it was all Republicans who wanted to do something about climate change. And there was not a single person there that wasn't interested in building some sort of movement within Congress. It was really, and we had the leaders of all of the different, we had the conference chair, we had all the people in positions of leadership on the relevant issues at this thing in Utah. And then 2 months after that, John Curtis launched what is now known as the Conservative Climate Caucus, which is almost 100 House members who have basically co-sponsored legislation, passed legislation, been a part of this national dialogue on climate change. And it's an amazing shift from where we were before that hike where we had that idea.
So let's go through a couple examples of such legislation. So the Chips and Science Act was bipartisan, included a lot of focus on R&D spending and clean technology. There was the farm climate, I was afraid of the name.
Farm climate, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which I want to I don't need to really talk about the policy itself right now, but I mean, we can, but the fact that a bill that was called the Growing Climate Solutions Act, it had the word climate in it, it passed the Senate 92-8. That doesn't happen anymore. That doesn't happen on anything. You could say, red, the color red is red, and somehow, some people would say it's not actually red. The fact that we got 92 senators out of 100 to vote for this thing was absolutely incredible. And then it passed the House nearly with the same kind of proportions. And it was, basically helping farmers be more efficient and sustainable on their property to lower carbon emissions and reward them with an incentive. But it was all about climate change. And so we saw that happen. The biggest investment in clean energy ever before the Inflation Reduction Act happened at the end of Trump's term, the Clean Energy Act of 2020, and that passed with massive bipartisan support. You had under Biden, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was tons of money towards sustainable infrastructure improvements. I mean, the list goes on, and there's actually more. There was a recent bill that passed that was bipartisan around nuclear. I mean, and it was around the topic of needing more nuclear to fight climate change. So we've seen a lot of possibility on the issue.
So I want to come back to that in a second, where the common ground is and where the possibility is. But I want to go back in time again quickly, because you speak powerfully on this. If you had to explain to a Martian why are Americans' views on climate change correlated with their views on abortion, you would struggle, right? What the heck does climate change have to do with abortion, right? Why are those not just completely non-correlated? And yet we have this partisan identity thing that makes you feel like being a conservative environmentalist in 2016, and hopefully to a lesser extent now, is an oxymoron. But let's go even further back than Claudine Schneider in the late 80s. Tell me some of the what you see as the conservative legacy in the United States on environmental issues.
I mean, the environmental legacy of the United States is 100% intertwined with conservative politics. There's no separation from it. So Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. He created NOAA. He signed into law the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. He created the legacy of our Parks Act, which is the biggest investment in national parks since Teddy Roosevelt, and it probably was bigger if you adjust for inflation still. He also funded the first ever climate assessment in United States history. The list goes on and on and on. And I was speaking at the Nixon Library a few weeks ago, and some of his old staff were still there, and they were, I asked them, I read the campaign booklet that he had put together for the 1980 election, and the environment was listed last, or 1970s, I can't remember the year, but the environment was listed last, and I couldn't believe it because his legacy is just so robust. And I asked these former staffers, why is this listed last if he had such a priority of it? And the answer was really shocking to me, but it also made a lot of sense, which was when Richard Nixon ran for president, you didn't have to campaign on the environment. It was an expectation that you lead on it, regardless of your political identity. And so it wasn't even talked about really on the debate stage. So it was listed last, but that wasn't a reflection of how much he was prioritizing it. It just was it was a given that he was going to prioritize it. So there's that legacy. There's also the legacy that George H.W. Bush set aside more public land than even Richard Nixon did. George W. Bush created the largest marine sanctuary of all time and actually was pretty active in funding climate assessments. And then you had even Ronald Reagan, who was really active on fixing the ozone problem. So there's a legacy there that goes back to Teddy Roosevelt. People think about that, but it's even a lot more recent than that. And I think the shocking statistic that tells you where things started to go wrong is that in 1990, over 80% of Americans self-identified as environmentalists. Over 80% of Americans in the year 1991. That number is 38% today. And that's with Gen Zers and millennials having this as a top priority. So that's even, it should have risen significantly, not dropped by over half. So it's gotten caught up in the cultural war like the topic of abortion. But unlike the topic of abortion, it didn't used to be this way. And of course, on abortion, you're going to have significant differences with one another. I don't know how you solve that. That's not my job. If it was, then I would be really sad. Because that's not fun to try to solve that issue across party lines. But on the environment, it was never caught up in that, and it's really disappointing that it has become that way. But the good news is it wasn't like that before, so it doesn't have to be.
So let's talk about how it came to be divisive and how maybe it's starting to be less divisive. There are many different stories that I've heard people tell about how this happened, but maybe let's focus on two. One that I would call economic and one that I would call cultural. And so the economic story is that free markets have always been a really important part of American identity and in particular maybe American conservative identity. And so too to some extent in other English-speaking rich countries, in particular among rich countries. Climate change in essence is a big market failure, right? The cost of our carbon pollution, and this would be true of any other type of pollution, is not borne by the producers and the consumers that emit it. It's borne by everybody, and markets, Econ 101 says markets alone can't fix that, right?
Yep.
Number one. Number two, in the 90s, it was really expensive to replace fossil fuels with renewables, right? And so different people place blame on different entities for pushing this narrative, but the way I see it, it's not hard to understand how, here's this market failure problem, so the government's going to have to be part of the solution, and it's going to be really expensive. It's not hard for me to imagine how any interest, vested or not, would be able to scare Americans, particularly conservatives, with that. So that's the economic issue, and the economics of climate change. It is still a market failure, but the economics of renewables have changed drastically, which we'll talk about in a second. The cultural story is, the libs want to take away our gas stoves, right? It's kind of a microcosm of it, right? This idea that there is some segment of the progressive environmental movement that is perceived, maybe in some cases accurately, to care more about upending the economic system to create their vision of utopia than solving climate change or any other issue. And so if we don't like that utopia, if it reminds us of some of history's deadliest dictators maybe, then anything that's attached to that seems scary, and then that gets into like a lifestyle thing. We want to take away your hamburgers, we want to take away your cars, we want to take away your gas stoves.
We want you to eat maggots.
We want you to eat insects.
Which I, by the way, have tried. It's really not that bad, but don't put me on the record on that.
So in your perception, where are we today with the how potent on the right is the economic story I just told you that's kind of negative about environmentalism and the cultural story?
Really good synopsis, and I think that it totally is intertwined still with both of those things, because the association people have economically is that it's just going to cost a ton of money, and that we are going to bankrupt our country in the name of saving the planet, and that these doomsday predictions aren't true anyways, which is also true, but they're like claiming that these doomsday predictions aren't true, and we're going to spend so much money that this is just a total farce and it's not worth it, and it's just an excuse to grow the size of government, which of course conservatives don't want to grow the size of government, unless it's on their pet projects, which is how politics works these days. But there's a real kind of like economic disincentive that people think that this issue has. But then also like culturally, people don't want to eat maggots, and they don't want to get rid of their gas stoves, and they want to eat birds, and they want to drive their car that they use for utilitarian reasons, and they want to be able to if you're a farmer or rancher or whatever, be able to haul your resources so that we can use them in the cities. And so like there's this cultural disconnect and there's an economic disconnect. Both of them are solvable, right? Like the economic angle is much better today than it ever was. You look at the countries that are lowering emissions the most in the world, and it's the countries that are growing their economy the fastest. You don't have to reduce emissions at the expense of the environment. Or the
among rich countries,
yeah,
but yes.
right. Yeah. No, but you don't have to. Yeah, you don't have to reduce emissions at the expense of the economy. Sorry, and you also don't need to like take away people's culture, right? There's a middle ground there, and I think that that's unfortunate. Like we're in such a like one size fits all politics where everything's one way or everything's the other way, and it's either we're using all of the government to solve this doomsday challenge and we're going to tell everyone what to do, or we're going to do nothing about it and it doesn't matter. It's like, well, maybe there's something in the middle, and maybe we should be doing something about it, but maybe we don't need to destroy people's livelihoods and the economy to do it. So that's, I think, starting to break through, maybe not in the national narrative yet because of how toxic our media and especially the presidential cycle is. Like we're all just so excited for this fall to be over because we just, I don't know about you guys, but I'm just tired of it. But there's finally this middle ground that's approaching, and that's why Republicans are getting active, because they feel like they can get active in a way that's not antithetical to their principles and doesn't feed into the culture wars on the opposite side of the aisle. And we have to keep building that, because that narrative really started in the early 2000s. That's when you see the belief in environmentalism start to drop so significantly. Because every time you said environmentalism or climate change, people associated it with these kind of economic downsides or the cultural downsides. And now people are starting to associate it with better things. And you can see that with clean energy, right? In states like Iowa and Texas and Georgia, clean energy is providing so many benefits to those states. When this became a tribal partisan issue, it wasn't bringing those benefits yet. So the fear-mongering and also some of the truth around that was really, it wasn't possible to see through it. Now you can in those places. And, now people are seeing the impacts of climate change more severely, and they want to have something done about it, and they're starting to see that there are balanced ways to get it done. So we're getting closer and closer to that middle ground, and I'm not talking about middle as in everyone's just compromising their principles, but just like everyone's represented at the discourse, and we're not going to get solutions that work for America if we are caught up in this negative mindset and we can't find that middle ground. But it's starting to happen, which is really good.
Do you think that in a way, the improving economics of renewables, in addition to making the politics easier, it also lowers the stakes a little bit? So you mentioned Texas. I believe Texas is leading the country in renewable generation. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was unipartisan, I believe 60% of the money is being spent in Republican districts. It turns out, where do you build solar and wind, right? Do you build it in rural areas? For example. And so you have all this innovation, right? And to be fair, the government did help with subsidizing some of the early R&D. Some people I've talked to in renewable industries argue that some of the early portfolio standard policies catalyzed investment. There's kind of this interesting feedback. But are we at a point, do you think, where if a Republican president, wanted to make everything stop, that the market forces would be too strong?
Yeah, I do. I don't think you're going to see some massive undoing of the progress we've made, because it is benefiting conservative areas so significantly. And it's not just benefiting conservative areas significantly. We also are dealing with the reality that 80% of the policies within the Inflation Reduction Act were originally bipartisan. So the Inflation Reduction Act, for those who aren't political wonks, it is basically just a concoction of a million bills into one big bill. 80% of the environment and climate and energy related bills were introduced by Republicans and Democrats. Now, when you put it all into one big policy in the midst of a midterm election year, and you put all the policies together on that topic, plus you add healthcare and pharmaceuticals
and
taxes, and you call it the Inflation Reduction Act, and you put it through a specifically partisan process where Republicans don't get to debate it, then of course it's going to pass on party lines in today's horrible political climate. I'm not justifying that it shouldn't have been bipartisan. I'm just saying that it's understandable. But the fact that 80% of those policies were originally bipartisan proves that there was a lot of conservative interest beforehand. Now there's even more conservative interest after, because the dollars are flowing to their areas. And I can't speak too much to this, but publicly, but there's a growing movement of what I can say is something that is public, which is that there was a group of House Republicans that put together basically a letter saying that we want to keep the Inflation Reduction Act clean energy policies. 17 of them signed on to it. And that's during an election year, they signed on to it. It definitely does not help them to sign on to that from a electoral standpoint because their Republican colleagues hate it. And in the base, they've been led to believe that it's so bad. But they did it anyways because they know it's important. So I don't fear that it's going to be reversed. I do fear that the progress would slow from a prioritization of future policies, in my opinion, Donald Trump or whoever the Republican, was going to be, could have led on what I would say is an America First environmental and energy agenda, which is we need to protect our environment because it's affecting Americans right now. We need sustainable agriculture. We need to manage our forests better. We need, more next generation, nuclear. We need to focus on, continuing what the momentum that's happening on renewables. We need to do more mining and minerals production in the United States that China's not doing at all. There could be a really cool agenda there for a conservative running for president. I fear that that's not something that would be pursued, but I'm not super worried that it would get pushed back. And as someone who works a lot in DC, there are a lot of groups that have right-leaning ties that do not want to see the Inflation Reduction Act get reversed. And everyone points to Project 2025, but that's not something that I think has any, at least on this issue, I can't speak to other topics, but they're not taking the environmental side of that seriously at all. And I hope that I don't eat crow later in saying that, but from what I've seen behind the scenes, that is not a chance.
Well, and some of that we saw, some of what I think you're forecasting, we saw in former President Trump's last term. So I believe that every, if not almost every, White House budget request had huge cuts to OAR and other major sources of climate science funding. And I believe that every year Congress's budget increased climate science funding related to the year before. And as far as I've heard, there were some Republicans that had something to do with that behind the scenes in Congress.
Yeah, there's an infighting that is happening within the Republican Party. There's a side that's and it's quiet. It's it's not like everyone's talking about this publicly, but there's the Jim Jordans and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the people who actually don't care about their constituents and whatever. And then there's the people who actually are really well intentioned who are trying to bring balance to this topic. And those people are for example, even Ron DeSantis vetoed a bill that would have made it impossible to put rooftop solar on Florida homes. The utility was trying to make it impossible by making it a monopoly for themselves, and it would have basically ruined the market for rooftop solar. Ron DeSantis still vetoed that. And so you're seeing a incredible kind of crossroads that the party is at. But the way to know where the party is at is based on where leadership is within the party in Congress. Kevin McCarthy, when he was Speaker of the House, created a climate task force. It was a project of his speakership that was solely dedicated to solving climate change. It wasn't whether or not climate change is real or not. And he appointed some of the most conservative members to lead that. In the Conservative Climate Caucus, there are some of the most conservative members of the House who are part of that. The tide is changing. And so yes, under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, there was a push to remove the word climate from things. That just shows you how bad the culture war thing is, because it was we're just going to remove the word climate from everything. And it's very obviously political showboating. He also at the time was denying climate change and saying that it was a hoax. He's not doing that, if you haven't noticed, this election. Yeah, you've noticed because you are super nerdy. But, for most people who don't think about what people are saying climate change every day, they wouldn't notice that. But he released policy that said he wanted to reduce carbon emissions and grow energy at the same time. That is a totally different tone than 8 years ago. So I do think that even with Trump, who's probably been our biggest hurdle to get through from a personal standpoint, because pretty much everyone else in the party kind of gets it, except for the crazy people. even he's shifting the tone on it. And I think it's a really good sign for those of us who actually want to solve problems.
Yeah, you mentioned Governor DeSantis. I think he's a really interesting case study in the contrast between what goes on behind the scenes and the cultural politics, right, of climate change. So I believe he also recently took the word climate out of some government things, at least I was read about that. But he also blocked drilling in the Everglades, invested a lot of money in the conservation corridor, invested a lot of money in mangrove restoration, which that sounds like a super random thing, but if you're facing hurricanes, that's really important because it makes the storm surge a lot lower. He invested a lot in seawalls. I attended a conference in Florida shortly after Hurricane Ian and heard his head of emergency management, who's not a political person at all, just rave at how detail-oriented and forward-thinking he was on hurricane preparedness. And I hope to God that helps. That's true right now, and that helps.
And on that point, so I was at this really big climate event in Florida called the Aspen Ideas Climate Festival, and I was on stage with probably like the AOC of the Florida House of Representatives, state house, like probably the furthest left member of the House of Representatives. And she's sitting up there like, not so far from Matt and I right now, and she's like, I hate Ron DeSantis, I hate him, except for on the environment. And it was a perfect example of how even in such a politically toxic administration as they are, like obviously he receives tons of attacks and you can like him or dislike him, it's a very toxic thing. The fact that they were able to get things done amidst all of that on the environment just shows the opportunity. Now the problem is he actually was I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that he was the first governor to appoint like a chief resiliency officer for the state of Florida, and it was specifically around the impacts of climate change. But then recently, he's completely backed off of that by removing the words climate from all the state materials. Why do you think that is? It's because it's part of this political culture war, and he, of course, is trying to tap into that, and he's kind of run out of other issues to do it on. And so he chose this as his next one. And so again, it's a perfect example of the problem, right? That he felt like he had to do that from a political standpoint, despite his great record on the issue. But it also shows you the opportunity that despite him doing that, he still is prioritizing it. And if you could just take it out of the political culture wars, more people would realize that this is something that you could work on across party lines. Because he's literally kind of contradicting himself in those decisions, but it shows the potential and also the problem.
So how to take it out of the culture war is really important, and I want to come back to that in a second. But first, the way we've been talking about this so far, a listener might hear us and think, well, everything was great in the 80s, and then the Republicans, took a turn for the worst, and you're helping drag them back on track. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about the climate conversation, particularly in the last few years, is there's a couple of areas where some naturally Republican, more comfortable ideas are actually really important in terms of leading. So, regulation for interstate transmission projects and nuclear are maybe two examples where if those people on the left and in the middle and people who want to get to net zero as fast as possible. You can't get anywhere fast if it takes 10 years to get a permit for a power line, which is the case for some interstate power lines, or 6 years to get a permit for a utility scale solar project. So tell me a little bit about what Republicans and bipartisan groups have been working on in terms of permitting reform and some of this stuff around next generation nuclear and how do we make it easier to build nuclear. Because I think it's the case, correct me if I'm wrong, that nuclear is the only source of power that's been getting more expensive over time, whereas all the other ones are getting cheaper or not changing.
Well, coal's also, in America at least, is getting more expensive in a lot of ways. But no, I mean, I completely agree that those are some areas of bipartisan opportunity. But it's not even just there. There was a massive bipartisan bill around managing our forests better to manage forest fires that was introduced about 6 months ago by a Republican and Democrat. A lot of bipartisan bills on sustainable agriculture. A lot around the international side. So Russia is one of the main drivers of uranium for nuclear fuel in the United States. We get a lot of the uranium fuel for our nuclear reactors from Russia. There's a bipartisan push to ban that. I mean, there's so many issues where there's bipartisan support on this issue that it's hard for me to even like talk about all the examples. Permitting reform is another one, where a lot of the IRA money cannot be deployed and emissions won't actually be reduced if we can't actually build things in the United States. Nuclear, there was a massive bill that was just passed about funding advanced nuclear reactors called the Advance Act that passed with another huge win in bipartisan support that President Biden signed. So the list goes on and on and on. I think what is unfortunate about it is that no one would ever know, right? Like I think hopefully I'm wrong about this, but I would think for most people in this room who are probably somewhat savvy politically, because you probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't at least of interest, like still I don't think most people know that these sorts of things are happening. And all we think about is the IRA passing in party lines. So that disappoints me. But also, I would say the reason why those things aren't getting done more quickly or aren't the norm is because America has made it so impossible to work across the lines without getting penalized. And if a Republican voted for the IRA, they would have been primary just because they voted for something that Democrats liked, and now they're suddenly a rhino. And if a
But hang on, why didn't
against,
that happen with infrastructure?
Well, it did in the House. I don't think any Republicans voted for it in the House. And then eight Republicans, I think, or there were a few Republicans in the Senate who voted for it, but it was your typical cast of characters who didn't have to run an election that year. I think every senator that voted for it on the right didn't have to run that year. But on the House side, you have to run, right? You have to run every 2 years. So it happens under every administration. Republicans don't want to give Democrats a win, and Democrats don't want to give Republicans a win. There's plenty of examples of that when Trump was president. In fact, I remember being in a meeting with a Democrat senator during the summer before the 2020 election when Trump was still president, and they were thinking of, or 2019, and they were thinking about passing the Great American Outdoors Act, which was going to fund our national park system. And there was a very significant chance that Democrats were going to block that piece of legislation because they didn't want to give Trump a win during an election cycle, and that they would just do it once they beat him. And that's so problematic. And so the reason I bring that up is because I'm bringing up Republicans' examples of not voting for Democrat things, but it does happen on the other side. And it's just sickening. And so these things are happening, but they're happening at small scale, right? The bills that I'm talking about that are passing at bipartisan levels are kind of like they're helpful and they move us in the right direction, but they're really, really tiny niche policies. And if you ever want to do something substantial on energy, which we need to do, we're falling behind, internationally in terms of energy production. If you wanted to do that on any of these very important topics that have bigger ramifications than just climate change, you're not going to get it done until elected officials feel like they can do it and work across the lines without getting penalized for being a rhino or a moderate Democrat. And I think that that's probably the main message that I have in touring around the country for this book is like it's not bad to work across the aisle, and this issue doesn't need to be caught up in that. Just because a Republican supports clean energy doesn't mean that they're the devil if you're a conservative, and just because a Democrat believes that we need to have, at least in the short term, more fossil fuel production while we're trying to meet energy demand doesn't mean that they hate the planet. Like, let's be real here. And I think we're getting, the politics are there, but the narrative is not.
You and I were at a conference in Nashville on depolarizing climate change last week. And there was a political science professor who's quite well known named John Sides who spoke. And one of the things he said that was kind of interesting related to the culture war, I want to get your take on. Basically said some of the best bipartisan cooperation on any issue happens behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. And so he said, if you're a Democrat and you want more bipartisanship on climate change, counterintuitively, if you're, say running for president or you're the president, you might help yourself by talking about it less. And one of the things I think that's really interesting about that comment is that there's been a little bit of news in kind of climate media in the last few months about how neither former President Trump nor Vice President Harris are talking about climate change. And some of that coverage has been negative. Why aren't they talking about climate change more? Do you agree with Professor Sides that maybe there's a glass half full angle on that? Like does the fact that it isn't occupying our cultural or attention in the way that, say, immigration and abortion are, does that open the door for making progress behind the scenes, or does it shut it out of the conversation because we're not talking about it?
I would say it's too soon to know, because I don't think the reason they're not talking about it is because of anything other than the fact that it's not a top priority for Americans right now. And understandably so, there are just so many more pressing issues, and so it just doesn't get as much airtime. So I don't know if it necessarily is a good or bad thing from a long-term standpoint. And what I do know is that both sides are inherently so stupid when they talk about this publicly, because they are so out of touch with where America is. Republicans don't realize that everyone in this country is okay with lowering carbon emissions in an economically sound way. I've never met anybody who doesn't believe that it would be I've never met somebody who believes it would be a bad thing to lower pollution in the atmosphere in an economically sound way. So the fact that they can't say that message is absolutely absurd. And I've also never met a Democrat who doesn't believe that we should protect the climate and protect humanity and keep energy prices low and keep energy reliable for people. But yet they both don't say those messages. And I will say Kamala Harris has shifted her tone slightly because energy demand is so up in the air, but that is a brand new thing, and she's trying to win over independent voters. So I will give her credit that she's done a little bit better on that. But they're both still in their corners of drill baby drill and fossil fuels are the enemy, and it's just this they're so out of touch with America, but they're pandering to their bases. And I think it's probably a good thing that we don't have them getting pressed on these questions, because I think it would just continue to alienate it. So I guess overall it probably is a good thing, but again, people's association with the word environmentalism, with the topics of climate change, has to be pulled out of this so that they don't feel like they have to do that. And the first party to realize that they don't have to do that is going to be in a really good spot on this issue, because people are just waiting for sensibility in general in America. We don't have a lot of it right now, but they're also waiting for it on this topic.
So this is a good segue into this question of, how do you get it out of the culture wars? And it seems like there's easy parts to that and hard parts to that. And so, one easy-ish part that you've alluded to is amplify the huge majority that are kind of not the, overrepresented on social media extremes. Because, you go out into the world and printing on social media, you can find videos of people who've intentionally made their trucks emit that black gasoline. I'm sure some of you have seen it on the highways. One of the things that, I think it's kind of funny, but those of you who like to play golf,
those people have no insecurity.
You're never going to unsee this now. A pretty good proxy for whether a county in Colorado is blue or red is whether the golf carts are gas or electric. Anyone else who's like me who's a big golfer in the room, you're never going to unsee this now. And the same thing on the other side, right? We don't have as much of it in the United States, but there really are some people on the far left that want to shrink the economy, right? As something that they see as intimately connected to the environmental agenda. This is, bigger in Europe than it is here, but it is a real part.
No, I mean, I was just
who want to abandon capitalism. So, but it's not most people, right? The vast majority of Americans, like affordable energy. They want a strong economy. They want, energy security in developing countries, which today are mostly fossil dependent. But they also want clean air and clean water to reduce emissions. So how do we amplify, as maybe one kind of relatively easy part, those voices, or at least help people understand the degree to which these issues are not as polarized among the public as we think?
Well, I don't know if you intentionally or unintentionally are leading into this, but he knows that I'm about to launch a campaign in the next few months called Nature is Nonpartisan. And the goal with that is going to be to reassociate the issue of the environment and climate change with what it should be about, which is the environment and the things that we're trying to protect, and doing it in a sensible way. And we're going to have celebrities from across the political spectrum, politicians from across the spectrum, sports stars from across the spectrum, everyday people from across the spectrum, all talking publicly about the same principles that we hold as Americans. Because I think we've got to popularize that idea in America again before we ever can solve it from a policy perspective. And that's the only way I feel like we can compete against like the AOC versus Ted Cruz kind of narrative, is to leverage people that ideally Americans look up to and are also a little bit shocked to see them talking with each other. It's not going to happen overnight, but I do believe that this issue is the one issue that could bring Americans back to like respecting each other again. And I know it's like super cliche to say that, but I genuinely believe that. But it's not going to happen without big name people who are well respected in society and everyday people who you're shocked to see believe the same thing you do, saying the same things about this issue. Because I think one of the most, people ask me often, because for reference, this is like my 26th city in 31 days. And people often ask me like, what's the most frustrating part of doing what you do? And other than, not sleeping in my own bed, it's the fact that every time that I go somewhere, whether that's Wyoming or New York City or rural Utah or Texas, where I was just in the oil fields down there in New Mexico, like everyone's saying the same thing. And it's like, what are we doing here? And again, I can't speak for other issues. Those issues could be rightfully polarized. But I have zero doubt that we can return to the days of this not being polarizing, but we have to get people's association to do that. And so we're going to be doing a campaign to get us back to that. And I don't know if it'll work. I mean, I could rewatch this recording in 5 years and be like, oh, those were the good old days when I was optimistic. But I genuinely think we're going to get there. And I think it's going to take a cultural change. And that's why I keep going back to the cultural, because politics is downstream of culture. And if culture is saying polarize the environment, our politicians are going to polarize the environment. And right now, that's the incentive.
So I want to ask you one more question, and then let's open up to audience Q&A. And this is about what I see as maybe a harder part of taking this issue out of the culture wars. And that is that
there's a harder part?
Oh no. And that is, I think, for some of the ways that it gets attached to the culture wars are not kind of silly signaling like the black smoking truck or the anti-capitalist utopia. It's I'll give you an example on the right and the left, right? So on the right, there are some communities, for example, in northeastern Colorado, coal communities, that really have something big to lose, right, in the energy transition, and it's not, and it's real. It's not just because they watched Fox News or Newsmax and got someone to scare about their insect burger or whatever. On the left, they're in. I'm mixing a couple of metaphors here.
Insect burger. Put that one down.
On the left. One of the things, for example, that my group's research has found is that a good way to make climate change more partisan is to tie it to identity-based social justice, right? Now, so the converse would also be true. A good way to make it bipartisan is to take it out of identity-based social justice. Now, many on the left would hear that and say, but what about Cancer Alley and communities like that are, what about the fact that pollution is more correlated with race than with income in this country? Some of that has to do with urban and rural, but no doubt some of it also has to do with history of this country.
Yep.
So how can we address some of those issues on both of those sides? And of course, that's not, although one of those issues focuses more on the right and one on the left, those are Americans that we should all care about because they're Americans. How can we address those issues compassionately while also minimizing the degree to which climate is in the culture wars?
So I will probably shockingly say that sounds way easier for me to solve
than the black trucks?
Than the cultural stuff.
Sweet.
And the reason is, I've been to all those different communities, and I can guarantee you that if you went to a urban liberal and you asked them, should a coal worker in northeastern Colorado who's going to lose their job have a pathway to having even more economic success under a pro-climate world, they would say yes every time. And I can guarantee you that if I went to that same coal community in northeastern Colorado and said, if someone is disproportionately impacted by pollution, should they, be able to have a healthier future, they would say yes every single time. So I do not think there's a disconnect there. The disconnect is the fact that both of those things are associated with different sides, and so people put it again back into the culture wars. But I'm also seeing that no one is okay with environmental racism, or the fact that low-income people, I won't even just say race-wise, but just low-income people are disproportionately affected by environmental disasters. You can see that with the hurricane. There's some people who can't leave, and there's some people who can, right? So that is something that I think we can all agree on across the spectrum is not okay. And I also think everyone across the spectrum would say, if you've dedicated 100 years to powering energy for our lives via coal power, that you should probably have the right to keep having a successful life. It just might look a little bit different, like in Kemmer, Wyoming, where they're building a next generation nuclear facility right next to a closing coal plant, and now those 2,000 jobs are transitioning from a coal facility to a nuclear plant. That is not that hard to solve. Again, I think that is solvable if it's not caught up in the culture wars. So, and I've seen that from my travels around the country, and coal plant workers want one thing. They want a healthy, safe community where they can have a job. Maybe that's 3 things. I don't know. But it's one kind of common thing. Every single person in that community that's disproportionately affected by pollution wants those exact same things.
Let's open it up to Q&A. Who has a question for Benji? Taylor, go ahead.
There's the guinea pig.
So I think both of you denigrated something that I sort of like about American politics, which is polarization. And so with respect to your issue,
Oh man.
with respect to your issue on the environment, what was the thing that happened in the world, the material world, when the rhetoric changed from being more positive, more bipartisan, to more negative since the 90s? The air got cleaner, manufacturing output was less energy or less carbon intensive, and maybe that partisan nonsense, that polarization, was just the fluff of American politics, and on this issue, the world got better. And partisanship had nothing to do with it. The fact that Ted Cruz wants to grandstand, or AOC wants to grandstand, didn't bite in the world.
All the things that happened that you listed off happened because of bipartisanship, though. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the things that made us transition to a healthier economy, plus just the shift from coal to natural gas and coal to renewables, that happened because of bipartisan policies. That could be rapidly increased through more collaboration. I work in Congress every single week. Nothing gets done because there's polarization. Polarization equals inaction, stagnation, and everyone loses when that happens. The states that are the least, there's a difference between polarization and debate and differences in opinion. And what I'll give as an example of that is states like Georgia and Arizona and purple states where there is polarization in the word meaning they're combating their ideas and coming up with solutions. That works because you have a competition of ideas, and a competition of ideas is going to result in solutions. That's not how our federal government is working, and I can guarantee you that we are worse off because of it, because we are falling behind in every category. Immigration is not being solved. Our education system in the United States is going down. We are exporting pretty much all the economic drivers in this country. Our country is honestly failing, and we are going down the wrong path. And I think we can, maybe you don't agree with this. I think most people would agree with that. And our cities are becoming more crime-ridden. Our entire rural areas are becoming like ghost towns. I've been to rural Louisiana where people are literally just walking around like meth heads, and there's people like that in urban Chicago too. There's a serious problem in this country. It's not getting better, and it's because our politicians do not care about anyone but themselves, and they're feeding into the polarization because it's incentivized, and that is what's wrong with America. And the thing that made America great was our ability to put our differences aside and solve problems together across the partisan spectrum. And until we get back to that, we're all going to be screwed.
Now, as an optimist, as a quick aside, I do feel the need to point out that American growth since the pandemic has been better than all the rich countries. And although crime did go up significantly after the George Floyd riots, it has come down in many measures, many types, in many cities in the last year or two. But I wanna now play pessimist a little bit, right? So here's what I think some climate activists, how that some would respond to Taylor's question. I want to get your thoughts on it, right? We recognize this problem publicly in a big way starting in the late 80s. We repeatedly set targets and missed them, and it took us so long to get our act together in this issue that now China's eating our lunch in terms of dominating some of the big industries. Even Russia, has a large share of some of the mineral mining. So in that sense, the polarization did have a cost to the issue. What would be your response to that?
China loves the polarization that we have on this issue because while we're bickering whether or not we should have clean energy or fossil fuels, they're building everything. While we're bickering about whether or not we should mine in the United States or whether we should have permitting reform, we can't get that done even though the majority of Americans want it. And even though there are members of the House and Senate on both sides that want it too, we can't get it done because neither side wants to give each other the win. There's a reason why 90% of the materials for solar panels come from China, 90% of the wind turbine materials. There's a reason why China is building more of every energy source because they are not polarized like we are. And I'm not saying I want to be like them, I don't. But they love the fact that we're in this political culture war where we can't get anything done and they're just going to keep forging ahead with their agenda. And that's true on every single issue. So, America has become a laughingstock because of our partisanship, and other countries are dealing with the same thing. So we're not unique in that way from a democracy standpoint right now. Democracy is at a really tough spot because there's a growing sense of division across the world. But it's because the reason why there's a division is because people feel left behind on both sides, and neither side on the opposite side is willing to address the other side who's feeling left behind. But this is all solvable, and America's best achievements throughout American history have happened because of cross-partisan collaboration, and have happened because people worked together across party lines and put aside differences and actually represented each other. Because the other thing is, when you have polarized politics, you get policies that only represent one side of the aisle. And there's a reason why we have a two-party system. You could argue that we should have more, but there's a reason why we have a two-party system. It's because half the country feels represented by one party-ish, and half the country feels represented by the other party. Their priorities are represented by those parties, or they're supposed to be, so that we have the ability to get things done for all Americans. But when only one side dominates the narrative, like you see in states where there isn't a competition of ideas, and it's just all one side or all the other side, things tend to go really awry. And that's why you need the competition of ideas. But in a polarized culture, you can't do that. So China and Russia, they love it. They think it's amazing. There's a reason they're buying bots to divide us even further. They want this for us. And until we realize that, they will become even bigger powerhouses in the global economy. And they're pouring in money to divide us, and they love it.
I'm going to come back to patriotism at the end, but let's do more questions. Earl.
I could really argue with you about China and their potential, but let's move on with the climate.
I don't think China has a lot of potential. I just think that they're investing in everything because they know economically it's going to help them.
Okay, we can buy that. But what about free enterprise? It seems to me that you've talked about public policy, but yet free enterprise has, in the past, for this country, from the Industrial Revolution on, been a huge part of how we've advanced as a country.
Totally.
And individuals have advanced socioeconomically. I don't hear you talking about it. I hear you talk about Washington. Why don't we do public policy that would enhance free enterprise with regards to the climate change?
Yeah, so I completely agree.
Permitting reform is an example.
I actually like we're talking about policy right now. and maybe we over-focused on that, but my entire book is about how the private sector is going to be the main driver of a lot of these solutions. What I said earlier, the countries that have reduced emissions the most are the ones who had the most economic growth. The countries that have...
Well, give me some examples of that.
The United States. The United States has led the world in lowering carbon emissions as our GDP has continued to grow.
I thought you were excluding us.
Since about 2005.
No, since the early 2000s, we have decreased emissions more than anywhere else. It's because of free enterprise. It's because of the private sector. Capitalism is being used for good right now. The entrepreneurs in this country and around the world are solving problems that are not solvable alone by government or even primarily by government. And maybe we over-focus on policy, but just to be clear, I think the federal government should be the last resort when it comes to these issues. If the private sector can't fix it, then you look to the local communities. If the local communities can't fix it, then you look to the state government. The last resort is the federal government. So the private sector is absolutely imperative in this, and there's no way that you can solve these challenges without innovation and free enterprise. So I completely agree with you on that. And I guess when I'm looking at policy, like permitting reform or like American policy to encourage businesses and encourage market development rather than disincentivize it, is critical. And you look at like nuclear, next generation nuclear, you look at all these different technologies that are coming up. It's because of innovators and entrepreneurs, and the best success story of electric vehicles came from Elon Musk. I mean, it's story after story after story that the marketplace creates better solutions than the government. So I want to hammer that point home, and I don't know how that didn't come up earlier, but that's a cornerstone of everything that I talk about, and I think people need to know that the government first mindset in solving environmental challenges is the wrong one. I think we probably over-focused on polarization a little bit, but when you have the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and AOCs battling it out who don't care about America, I'm not going to trust them to figure it out. I'm going to trust the private sector to figure it out. Definitely more than those two and how they represent America.
So one quick follow-up question to kind of push you a little bit from the other side, right? That I mentioned at the beginning that climate change is a big market failure, right? That we have this externality, this cost. Econ 101 says the government has a role. Now, I personally agree that the private sector has a huge role to play too, but where do you think are the areas where the government can help the most?
I think it's where the trade-offs aren't fixable by the marketplace, which is most of the time not the case. Like, I agree that capitalism, like every decision we make in humanity's existence has trade-offs, right? The fact that we're standing up here right now has trade-offs. We have trade-offs in terms of our time and our energy. We have trade-offs in terms of the fact that we're using something that needs to be charged later, and that's going to take energy and resources. That's always going to be true. The role of capitalism, as I see it, is to solve those trade-offs. So, like, yes, capitalism created the fossil fuel industry that has propelled us to be able to have such an incredible world that we live in, and we should not, shoot that down. Then the role of capitalism now is, okay, if that has a trade-off, right, that pollution is impacting our world, what can capitalism do to solve that problem? And you look at like what the government has tried to do on ocean pollution, which is spend tons of money on ocean pollution in the United States, and other countries have tried it too. The company and nonprofit 4Ocean has been far more effective at finding solutions to that and cleaned up millions and millions of pounds of waste because they didn't have to worry about government bureaucracy. The truth is that on steroids for energy and in like even like transportation, hybrids came out of a free market competition in Japan about how to, like, these companies over there realized that everyone wanted a more fuel efficient car. We got the Prius from Japan because of that reason. The United States was setting all these standards for fuel in the United States, and none of the automakers knew what to do. They felt handcuffed by it, and so then we ended up, exporting the best idea to those in Japan who came up with the Prius, which is now still the highest sold hybrid in America. So, yes, capitalism has contributed to this, but if capitalism has contributed to it, I do believe that capitalism is the solution. And then the government should step in where capitalism can't solve that. And so in the book, I detail how there's regulations that have been successful and regulations that have definitely not been successful. And I also talk about how incentives are sometimes successful and sometimes unsuccessful. It honestly is a case-by-case basis, and anybody who relies on the private sector only and just wants anarchy and no government, which I don't think is what anybody in this room wants, like, that isn't good, and neither is relying on the government first. And to your point, sir, I think that too often the environmental conversation is federal government first. We don't think about anything else. And you wonder why people feel left behind. It's because how do you know that someone 1,500 miles away is going to actually represent you in the right way? They can't do just about anything right, it seems like, a lot of the time, and trusting them to do the right thing on this probably isn't going to be the right thing if that's the only thing that you're focusing on.
Okay, let's take Jerry, and then you go ahead.
So, thank you. I find this incredibly fascinating. I run the long-term recovery for the Marshall Fire. So I've been knee-deep in the environmental and local, state, and federal level, and basically every day. What I found fascinating about your percentages of this whole point of what we thought we were as environmentalists at a certain, so there's a lot of people in this room that are of an age where we grew up with Smokey the Bear, we grew up with like all those different things where it was cute to recycle, and environmentalist was something to be proud of because we're all sharing and taking care of the earth, right? We've gotten so far away from that. So you brought up the idea of narrative. I'm going to bring up the fourth estate here. I mean, the media obviously loves almost as much as China to see this divided because it sells. Where do you think, I mean, they've obviously been captured from both sides in some ways, but for the majority from left. What is the solution kind of to get the information if you're trying to build bottom up again and reframe this? How do you work with the media that, you know, increasingly loves to call it climate and doesn't even talk about the idea of the environment and nature and all those good fuzzy things?
Really good point. And that's why, so in this Nature's Nonpartisan campaign that we're going to run, it's going to be about the things that make people connected to the environment again. Because environmentalism doesn't remind people of the environment anymore. And that's a really big problem. Like, it should remind us of hiking or fishing or hunting. Or,
it's a dirty word.
Right, it's a dirty word, and it should be the exact opposite of that. And so I think it's, first of all, returning to that identity, but it's kind of taking like the playbook that they are using by, you know, basically propelling these big influencers to be dividers, right? And taking influencers who don't want to be that and leveraging their voice on this. So like, I can't tell you who we're going to be leveraging because it's too soon to say that, but it's people that we all look up to across the spectrum who are going to be talking about these things in a way that resonates with the majority of Americans, because it needs to have that positive affiliation again. If we're working together to protect the environment, it should be a positive thing. And like, we might have differences in getting there. You know, you and I, you might agree that the private sector is more important, and maybe somebody else doesn't agree with that. But we can find some common ground there, but not when it's caught up in the toxicity that the word is. So the narrative is going to be focused on that, and we're going to have really, really surprising allies, but also really positive people who you know of in the same way that you would know of AOC or Ted Cruz in terms of that fame, but we're going to have them be maybe more positive voices, because I think that's what people are looking for. And if the media is probably not going to cover it as much as they should, but if all these people promote it on their social media channels and in their lives, I think we can break through.
Question over here, and then we'll do one online.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the private sector, because I do think that's an important piece. I worked in the private sector, now I work for NOAA. We're good at science and we're good at leading the discussion. We have a lot of red tape that slows down technology development in particular. So moving forward, hoping that we can all, you know, agree on the environment and get to a better place and kind of, you know, clean up America and lead technology-wise. A lot of people say that since this is a global issue, that to really solve the problem of climate change, we will have to potentially, people will have to lead developing nations and support them, and potentially through means such as technology transfers, things like that. If the U.S. is a global leader in the technology that enables us to get to this point, do you think that America should be a leader that is supporting these countries? And if so, does that come in clash with conservative values such as, you know, this, obviously there'll be private sector technologies, but the cost may require, you know, government subsidization to actually do those technology transfers. We may run into export issues, especially if we're talking about nuclear technology. Is this a problem that you've thought of, and do you think that America should take on this role, and does that clash with conservative values?
It's a really, really solid question. Thank you. first of all, I couldn't agree more that the red tape is preventing us from action. I mean, you look at like in this issue of permanent reform, which we brought up a few times, like the government is its biggest prohibitor of action that it says that it wants, and so absolutely agree on that. When it comes to international cooperation, I get asked all the time, like, okay, if China and India are just going to keep polluting, like, why should the United States even do anything? And similarly, like, you know, if it's so expensive here, why should we do it here and you know, have these developing countries not do it? Totally understand those points. I think that the answer to that, again, is the private sector, because no country, and rightfully so, will ever do the pro-environmental thing unless it saves them money and creates them jobs. There's a reason why China is polluting more and more every single year. It's because that's the best thing for them economically. And I don't see that changing anytime soon until they see an incentive to stop polluting. And the incentive to stop polluting is technology that saves them money and boosts their economy. That is going to come out of countries like the United States, who have innovators who are coming up with really cool solutions. And you know, I'm going around the country seeing so many amazing innovators and entrepreneurs who are dedicating their lives, especially like Gen Z millennials, like our generation, dedicating their lives to generating a huge profit, right? They're not trying to like, you know, do this like mission-based thing and not make money. They're trying to make a lot of money by helping protect the planet at the same time. Those are the sorts of technologies that we can export through the fact that other countries are going to want it. They, you know, whether that's more energy efficiency, whether that's cheaper energy sources, cheaper transportation options, until it's greener from a financial perspective and an environmental perspective, no country's going to do it. That's where I see so much hope in the private sector in the United States. And if the government could get out of its own way, I think we could do it a lot quicker.
Okay, question from our online audience from a listener named Chris. Chris says, I've been following you for more than 6 years and commend you on the work that you have done. With that said, you speak about private fossil company partnerships. How are we supposed to trust those companies now? And what ways can we ensure / push them without government regulation?
Well, thank you, Grist, first of all. 6 years, that's like half my lifetime, so I appreciate it.
You were in high school?
Yeah, I was probably in high school or something. No, I was in college, you know, just to be clear. But no, it's a really good question. I would say the first answer is we don't have another choice but to work with the fossil fuel industry, because that's what's providing the power that we're using on a day-to-day basis, and you know, production of fossil fuels is not going down anytime soon. We need to work with the fossil fuel community to develop more energy here in the United States as cleanly as possible. And America does create fossil fuel production much cleaner than other countries. Our natural gas carbon impact in the United States is about half that of Russia. And so if you're trying to decrease carbon emissions, you have, and that can go down even more. We just toured a fossil fuel company rig today where they are pledging, and they already have proof that they are the first carbon neutral fossil fuel production for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is a very wonky term. But they're basically mitigating their entire carbon impact, at least until it gets to the point where we're using it. But like they're basically removing the flaring, they're capturing the carbon at the source, and it's because they see that that's where the world's heading, and they want to be on the forefront of that. And so there are plenty of examples like that, and I understand why, because of decades of fossil fuel companies not talking about climate change, it seems like it might be disingenuous, but we are going to need to meet energy demand with fossil fuels at least for the next couple of decades, and there's no other choice but to trust that we can work with them. It's not like blindly trust, but it's trying to encourage them to be more efficient and more clean, and doing it here in the United States is a big part of that. But the amount of efficiency and like dedication that these companies have had towards getting better, and I know it sounds like I'm shilling for them, but I'm really not, because I used to be on like the ban fossil fuel train. Like I used to think it was that simple when I was in high school, more than 6 years ago, to be clear. That is something that I've really come to terms with, is that collaboration with these companies is important, that there's a lot of well-intended people within the industry, and there's a lot of amazing technology that could lower the impact of fossil fuels while we're still using them. And if we just push these companies aside and say, no, we're not going to work with you because you did these bad things a few decades ago, then we're actually going to have a more negative environmental impact, because that collaboration could go a long way to solving this issue.
There's one quick follow-up question on this. There's a really interesting debate, which comes up in a bunch of different contexts, but it's come up recently kind of within the left on climate, where, it's kind of Joe Manchin climate hawk versus Joe Manchin obstructionist, right? And one side of it says that you need people like Joe Manchin to come to the middle and find the common ground and get stuff done, and that does way more for society than throwing soup on paintings or blocking traffic or other things. The other argument is that people who, and maybe throwing soup and blocking traffic are extreme examples, but people like, say, Greta Thunberg, right, who has some policy positions that are out of step with the vast majority of Americans, but has undoubtedly raised enormous awareness about the climate change issue in the media and on the global stage. And some people would argue that activists like that create the market signals that then the fossil fuel companies, like the ones that we toured this morning, follow. And if they didn't, then even though they're not doing it maybe in always quite the right way, that there wouldn't be those market signals and we might not have that progress. What would be your response to those arguments?
I would say that awareness doesn't always equal positive impact. The work that our organization has done, which I'm sure there's some people in this room who had heard about what we've done, but there's probably more people who know who Greta is than know what we've done in this room, let alone obviously globally. I would argue that the 55,000 people who work with ACC, who have a very low profile compared to Greta and her probably, a few million followers, that those 55,000, our organization has done way more than what she's done. And in fact, I think she's hurt the ability to get things done because people's association with the issue is so bad. Like, if my only association with the issue is Greta, I would just completely tap out and run the other way. And that's coming from somebody who testified at Congress with her, and I can understand why she does what she does, but it's not to actually further the issue, it's to further herself. And so I would just say that while maybe some of those people started well-intended and maybe they wanted to do the right thing originally, that it actually ends up backfiring. And it's like saying, well, if AOC wasn't so crazy, then then where would the Democratic Party be? I don't know, but AOC doesn't accomplish anything, and in fact, she makes it harder to accomplish things, just like Marjorie Taylor Greene makes it harder. But just because they have big followings and a lot of awareness doesn't mean that they're actually going to get things done. And I think that mindset in the world is part of why we are struggling to solve such complex problems. Because the louder someone is doesn't mean that they're impactful.
So without getting into the mindsets of specific people, maybe let me reframe the question in this way. Did companies like the one we tour today, did they wake up one morning and say, I should lower my emissions? Or were there also some market signals that they were being sent, that then they harnessed the power of innovation?
Totally.
And if so, who sent those signals?
I think it's a market signal that over the last 40 years, people have wanted cleaner and cleaner technologies. I mean, everyone who was born before I was remembers the air pollution in cities. No one wanted that at the level that they were. No one wants to have fires starting in streams like there were in Ohio, before the Clean Water Act. Rivers shouldn't start on fire. That's not how that works. I'm no science major, but it doesn't seem right. So that I think there's just a growing demand for the world to be a healthy, clean place, and I don't think Greta is, or even anyone like her, or the concoction of people like her, are the reason why we're doing this. It's the fact that as a society, we want, especially once we become resource rich, which we have been as a country, we have money, we have the ability to develop society, we want to limit the trade-offs. And in this case, one of the trade-offs is environmental impact, and we're dedicating resources to it. But I don't think that those people are the reason. I really don't. And in fact, I would say, look at how much different and polarized the topic was. In 2008 and 2012, Republicans and Democrats were both talking about their environmental policy platforms. But then once it became the Greta, kind of dialogue, and I'm not blaming her for that because she just fed into it, but it wasn't her fault that it was created. Then it became a lot harder to actually get things done for the environment when we were actually kind of moving forward together as a country on it as it was. So I don't think that spurred the action. You look at like hybrids, EVs, all that stuff was happening before her. So I think it's just a transition that America and the world wants to have, which is a prosperous planet and a cleaner planet. Both things to be true at once.
Okay, we're basically out of time. Do you have a really short question?
I think it's short.
Okay.
It's short enough.
So you mentioned that, we want a clean, healthy world. We all can all agree we want clean air, clean water. And then you throw in climate change.
Yep.
Which I see those as two totally different things. One is protecting our environment, taking care of our world, and being what I consider a conservationist. The other is correlating that to making the conclusion or drawing the conclusion that it's also driving our climate. And I think that the jury is still out on that. And it seems like you've completely accepted that conclusion. So I just wanted to see if that's true. And then, on what basis do you really, it seems like most of the information that comes out that contradicts that conclusion is not allowed to surface. It's not ever given most of the times it's just kept out of the mainstream view.
I totally understand and respect that position, but I don't think that the two should be, I think the two are together. I think believing in lowering pollution in the atmosphere should go hand in hand with protecting our air and protecting our planet. I don't think that those two are separate things. When you're talking about fighting climate change, I understand that the association with it is incredibly negative because of what's happened over the last few decades. I totally understand that, but that does not mean that there's not a problem going on, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be lowering pollution in the atmosphere. If you put carbon dioxide in a box, it will heat up. There is just a true reality, and even the fossil fuel companies have acknowledged that decades ago. They admit that this is a real thing. Scientists agree that it is a real thing. They disagree on the level of severity and how much it will impact society over a certain course of time. But the vast majority do not disagree that it is a problem. They agree that it's a problem. Now, I would say, how much are we willing to risk that our pollution in the atmosphere is not contributing to this? Every year is hotter and hotter and hotter on record. The storms are getting worse. I'm not trying to sound like an alarmist because I'm not. I do have a lot of optimism. But the average temperature around the world is increasing every single year, and it has been on average since the Industrial Revolution, multiple degrees. How much are you willing to risk that has nothing to do with human activity? And let's say you don't believe that climate change is real, and you don't think that human-caused climate change is real, and that we're not contributing to it. That's okay. What's the downside of reducing carbon emissions that humans are creating in the atmosphere in a way that's economically smart? There's no downside. If you can reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere while creating jobs, boosting the economy, boosting people's livelihoods, you don't have to believe that is a problem to say that is a positive thing for society to do that. And so I would say we kind of need to leave the debate. If you don't believe it's real, that's fine. I'm telling you that it is. You don't have to believe me though, and I'm sure, Matt, you can agree with me that you believe it is too. That's okay. But there are ways to reduce pollution in the atmosphere in an economically sensible way, and there's no reason why we shouldn't pursue that.
There's the potential that there's global warming. The question is it human cause? And the world has heated up many times over the millions of years without humans causing it. So could it just be a natural evolution and that we're in a global warming trend now?
I'm going to take this one just because I'm standing between everybody and dinner now. But there is no. I appreciate the question. There is very strong evidence that it's human caused. In fact, the amount that we've warmed, which is about 1.2 degrees since the post-industrial era Celsius, sorry, Canadian, a couple degrees Fahrenheit. Our aerosol emissions have been cooling the planet a little bit, and so we actually have not warmed as much as our fossil emissions would have had us warm otherwise. This is maybe a bit of a flippant answer, and we should talk about it more later. But the most cited study that I ever published as a faculty member was casting doubt on the really hot emission scenarios that were being overused by the IPCC. So what I would say is, I was willing to say unpopularly that we were wrong about that. I would tell you if we were wrong about this, about climate change being real, we're not. But let's talk about it more after. I want to end really quickly just by saying, you made a very bold claim earlier that this is the issue that could unite us. And so maybe as a final thought, climate change is becoming, an election issue for Republicans, as we found in our work, and young Republicans who want to have conservative values that don't need to be correlated with climate, want their party to come to the table. I think a lot of Democrats who see this as a global problem want to have both parties come to the table. Here you are. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And maybe tell us, what about America's environment makes you patriotic, as a final thought?
Well, first of all, I appreciate that, and I would say in the theme of the last question, which I really appreciate, I would say that being pro-environment and being pro-climate can and need to go hand in hand for us to succeed. The world is moving towards lower carbon energy sources. It's moving towards a pro-environmental future. And it doesn't matter if you believe in climate change or not. We share this planet with each other. We rely on the resources that the planet provides for each other. We rely on the health of our ecosystems and the world around us for each other. And there's nothing more American than believing in individual freedom, but also believing in our country being the best in the world at everything that we do. Protecting the environment is something that we can be the best in the world at. And we have been in a lot of ways. We can continue to be. And whether that's to decrease carbon emissions or to support your local community and your local lake or your local farm, it's all pushing for the same thing. And that's something that we all face together as Americans. There's nothing that we share more than this intersection of our love of the environment, our need for reliable, affordable energy, and strong communities. And all those things can go hand in hand. And you can believe in that because you believe climate change is the most existential threat of our time, or because you just want a stronger America. I believe that differing heads on the topic of climate science and people who think that it's the worst thing in the world can actually come together around a lot of these policies. And there's nothing more American than coming together for the same theme for different reasons. And we can do that on the environment. We did it before. We did it for different reasons at that time too. Not everyone had the same reason for wanting to protect the environment, and we're going to do it again, whether or not the powers that be want that to happen.
This country has the Flatirons, the Everglades, the Appalachian Trail, the Boundary Waters, the Santa Barbara Channel, the Tetons, among many, many others. How could that not make you sentimental? Take it from a Canadian. Benji Backer, thanks so much for joining us.